Hello and welcome everybody. Thank you for listening to today's edition of the Daf Yomi, the Menachot Daf 87. A Daf of first class seems to be about the most mundane of topics, measurements. But as Rabbi Shimon Schwab once taught, there is no such thing as a mundane topic in the Torah or the Talmud. Everything, every detail, every comma is a window into the mind of the Almighty. The Mishnah on our Daf begins by telling us about the special measuring vessels in the Beis Hamikdash, the holy temple for the meal offerings. It says that there were two measures for dry goods: a full isaron, 1/10 of an ephah, and a half isaron. The Gemara then delved into the classic machlokas dispute between Rabbi Meir and the sages. Now that this is not just a disagreement over a measuring cup, this is a fundamental debate about the nature of divine instruction. The sages, you see, understand the purpose of these different measures. One is for the general meal offerings, while the other was specifically for the Menachos HaKohen HaGadol, the meal offering of the high priest. This offering, Agamor explains, was measured in its entirety and then divided into two equal halves. But our Rabbi Meir, with his piercing insight, holds a different view. He sees a deeper meaning in the unusual way the word Isaron is written in the Torah, with a small dot over the letter Vav. He doesn't believe that we should derive anything from that dot, as it's not a standard feature. The Gemara continues with a fascinating discussion questioning why the dot would not be significant. It's an investigation into the very fabric of how we interpret the written Torah, a beautiful example of precision and care of our sages. And then we move into the conclusion. So let's dive straight into the Mishnah. Shetei midos sheyaveshu b'mikdash isaron v'chatzi isaron v'b'mei omei isaron v'chatzi isaron. Two sizes of measuring vessels for dry substances were used in the temple. The Mishnah should not be misconstrued as saying that there were only two measuring vessels in the temple. Clearly, the intention is that two different sizes were used, and there was certainly a number of vessels of each size. So this would have to have been so, as otherwise, when several meal offerings need to be brought at the same time, it would take unfeasibly long time to measure the required quantities of flour consecutively. And answer the Menachot Daf. Two measuring vessels for dry substances were used in the temple. One held 1/10 of an ephah, and the other held 1/2 of an ephah. The 1/10 of an ephah vessel was used for measuring fine flour for meal offerings, and 1/2 of 1/10 of an ephah vessel was used to divide 1/10 of an ephah of flour into two equal portions for use in the high priest's griddle cake offering. This is in accordance with the opinion of the first Tanakh from the Rambam Sefer Hilchot Kli Mikdash 1:16 for measuring flour of the meal offerings. One held 1/10 of an ephah, and the other held 1/2 of 1/10 of an ephah. Rabbi Meir says there were three measuring vessels. That one held 1/10 of an ephah. Another one also held 1/10 of an ephah, and a third one that held 1/10 of an ephah. What purpose did the 1/10 of an ephah measuring vessel serve? It was the vessel with which one would measure flour for all meal offerings. One would not measure the flour by using a measuring vessel of a size that held the entire volume of flour required at once, and neither with a vessel of 3/10 of an ephah for the meal offering accompanying the sacrifice of a bull. When measuring the required quantity of fine flour for various meal offerings, both communal and individual, one does not measure the flour by using the measuring vessel of a size that holds the entire volume of flour required, e.g. with a vessel of 3/10 of an ephah for the meal offering accompanying the sacrifice of a bull, or with a vessel of 2/10 of an ephah for a meal offering accompanying the sacrifice of a ram. Rather, one measures the required quantity by repeatedly using the 1/10 of an ephah measuring vessel. Sefer Hilchot 2:8. Nor with a vessel of 2/10 of an ephah for measuring for the meal offering accompanying the sacrifice of a ram. Rather, one measures the flour for them by repeatedly using the 1/10 of an ephah measuring vessel to measure the required number of tenths. What purpose did the 1/2 of 1/10 of an ephah measuring vessel serve? It was the vessel with which one would measure the flour of the high priest's griddle cake offering. 1/10 of an ephah was required each day. He sacrificed half in the morning and half of it in the afternoon. The Gemara cites a Braita that clarifies Rabbi Meir's opinion. There's taught in a Braita that Rabbi Meir would say, What is the meaning when the verse states a tenth for every lamb, Numbers 28-29? The fact that the word tenth appears twice teaches that there were two measuring vessels that each held a tenth of an eighth in the temple. One of them held that volume when it was heaped, and the other one was slightly larger and held that same volume when the flour was leveled with the rim. So let's explain that. Chadush, heaped, mechut, leveled. In the Talmudic period, there were two forms of measure. These two forms of measurement were commonly used in commerce. In some places, the quantity was always measured using a heaped vessel. In other places, a level vessel was always used, in conjunction with a specialized rod referred to as a leveler, which was used to smooth over the substance being measured and ensure that it was perfectly level with the brim of the vessel. There was a third form of measuring referred to as a tafuf, in which the substance rose above the brim of the vessel, but it was not heated to the fullest extent possible. Since the extent to which it did rise above the brim was somewhat arbitrary, this form of measuring was not used much for commercial transactions. It was used in the temple service for measuring the handful of incense to be used in the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur. The high priest was required to fill the cup with his hands with incense in a way in which it was neither fully heated nor entirely level. And there's a picture in the stand shelf on page 247 if you have the Gemara. The one that held a tenth of an eighth when heaped was the vessel with which one would measure the flour of all meal offerings. Rabbi holds that there were two types of measuring vessels for measuring a tenth of an eighth. One measuring its quantity when heated and the other when level. It stands to reason that they were used for different purposes, as the Gemara proceeds to explain its Tosfot. Amud B. The one that held a tenth of an eighth when leveled was a vessel with which one would measure the flour for the high priest's griddle cake offering. The early committee discussed why specifically the leveling measuring vessel was used. Some suggest that it was due to the fact that after a tenth of an eighth of flour was measured, half of it would be poured into the half-tenth vessel in order to divide up two equal portions. Therefore, there was concern that if the flour was heaped above the brim of the first vessel, when it was transferred to the smaller vessel, some of it might spoil and be lost. To prevent this, a leveled vessel was used. Rashi and Tosfot others explained, and since it was necessary to produce two precisely equal half-tenth portions, it was therefore necessary to measure the original tenth of an eighth with the highest possible degree of accuracy. This can be achieved with a leveled measuring vessel, whereas the use of the heaped one always involves a certain degree of imprecision. That's from the Rashba. And then that flour would be divided into two equal parts. And the rabbis disagree with me and say there was only one measuring vessel that held that tenth of an eighth there, the temple as is stated, and 1/10 part for every lamb, Numbers 29-4. But if still, what is the meaning when the verse states a tenth for every lamb, Numbers 28-29? Now we may derive from the repetition of a tenth that there were two measuring vessels that held a tenth of an eighth. How do the rabbis expound that? They hold that it serves to include another measuring vessel for dry substances, that one holds 1/2 of a tenth of an eighth. Having cited the Braita, the Gemara discusses each opinion, and as for Rabbi Meir, from where does he derive that there was a measuring vessel that held 1/10 of an eighth? He derived it from the superfluous and in the phrase and 1/10 part for every lamb. The Gemara asks, and as for the rabbis, why do they not expound from this term and? They do not derive anything from the and. They hold that the addition of the word is not significant enough to be expounded. The Gemara asks, and as for Rabbi Meir, this verse and 1/10 part for every lamb, from which the rabbis derived that there was only one measuring vessel of a tenth of an eighth. What does he do with it? The Gemara answers that verse teaches that one should not measure the flour by using a measuring vessel of a size that holds the entire volume of flour required, and neither with the vessel that holds 3/10 of an eighth for the meal offering accompanying the sacrifice of a bull, nor with a vessel that holds 2/10 of an eighth for the meal offering accompanying the sacrifice of a ram. Rather, measure the flour for them by using a 10th eighth measuring vessel multiple times. The Gemara asks, and as for the rabbis, when they derive that halacha, the Gemara explains they derive it from its dot. In the Torah text, a dot appears above the term a tenth. This is as it is taught in the Braita. Rabbi Yossi says, Why is the letter Vav in the middle of the term a tenth Isaron dotted the first time that the term a tenth appears in the verse concerning the first festival of the day of the festival of Sukkot? The verse there states and a tenth for every lamb on the 14 lamb, Numbers 29:15. This serves to teach that one should not measure flour using a vessel of a size that holds the entire volume required, i.e., neither with a vessel that holds 3/10 of an ephah for the meal offering of a bull, nor with a vessel that holds 2/10 of an ephah for the meal offering of a lamb. And as for Rabbi Meir, what does he derive from the dot? He does not derive anything from its dot. He holds that the dot is not significant enough to be expounded. The Mishnah teaches, what purpose did the 1/2 of a tenth of an ephah measuring vessel serve? It was the vessel with which one would measure the flour for the high priest's griddle cake offering. A tenth of an ephah was required each day. He sacrificed half in the morning and half in the afternoon. From the Mishnah, it appears that each half-tenth is measured separately. The Mishnah indicates that the half-tenth vessel was used for measuring. And the Gemara raises a contradiction to this from a Mishnah into 50b. The 12 loaves of matzah, baked from a tenth of an ephah of flour, of the griddle cake offering of the high priest, did not come from the house of the high priest in Haas. Rather, the high priest brings it from his house, a complete tenth of an ephah of flour, see Leviticus 6:13, and divides it in half. And he sacrifices half in the morning and half in the afternoon. It is apparent from this mission that the tenth of an ephah is first measured in entirety and only then divided. To resolve the contradiction of Sheshes said, what is the meaning of use of measuring that the Mishnah here teaches? It means that the high priest would divide the half-tenth of an ephah into 2 equal portions using the half-tenth measure, but the quantity would initially be measured in its entirety, as the Mishnah on 50b states. In light of Rabbi Meir's opinion, there were 2 vessels for measuring a tenth of an ephah, one that held its measure when leveled, and one when it was heaped. Rami Bar Hama raised a dilemma before Rav Chisda. With regard to the 1/2 of a tenth of an ephah measuring vessel, according to the opinion of Rabbi Meir, was it that it held its measure when heaped, or was it one that held its measure when leveled? Before citing Rav Chisda's response, the Gemara provides a mnemonic that alludes to the 3 dilemmas it will immediately present. Half griddle cake offering table. This alludes to the 1/2 of a tenth of an ephah, the high priest griddle cake offering, and the shewbread table. Rav Chisda said to Rav Ami, but why do you ask specifically with regard to the opinion of Rabbi Meir? The dilemma can be raised according to the opinion of the rabbis. Rami Bar Hama answered, according to the opinion of the rabbis, it would be with regard to the measuring vessel of a tenth of an ephah itself that one raises a dilemma, asking whether it was one that held its measure when heaped, or was one that held its measure when leveled. The dilemma I raised concerning the half-tenth vessel, which is pertinent specifically according to the opinion of Rabbi Meir, as he holds that there were both heaped and leveled measuring vessels of a tenth of an ephah. In answer to Rama Bar Hami's dilemma, Rav Chisda said to him, from the opinion of Rabbi Meir concerning the vessel of a tenth of an ephah, we can extrapolate what Rabbi Meir holds concerning the vessel of 1/2 of a tenth of an ephah. And from that opinion of Rabbi Meir, we can extrapolate what the rabbis hold concerning both vessels. Rav Chisda elaborates, from the fact that Rabbi Meir said that the vessel of a tenth of an ephah used for the high priest's griddle cake offering held its measure when leveled, we can extrapolate that the vessel of 1/2 of a tenth as well was such that it held its measure when leveled. Why is the fact that the level measuring vessel was used to measure a half-tenth of an ephah necessarily means that the half-tenth vessel was also leveled? According to the explanation of the Rashba, a leveled measuring vessel was used to ensure the highest degree of accuracy. It is understandable that this reason simply applies to the half-tenth vessel, but according to the explanation of Rashi and Tosfot, that the use of a leveled vessel used for the tenth of an ephah was due to a concern that it may spill when transferring the flour to the smaller vessel. Why was it necessary for the smaller vessel to also be leveled, given that after the flour has been placed into it, it is not poured into another vessel? Some suggest that there is always some concern that when a heaped vessel is used, that some flour may spill. In this case, it would be particularly problematic, as it would leave 2 unequal portions at the other shlomo. Others suggest simply that since the 2 vessels are used together, it is appropriate that they may be of the same type, Karen Ora. Others add that in general, the reason to use a heaped vessel is that it provides a superior, more generous appearance. Therefore, it would be logical to require the half-tenth vessel to be heated. Nevertheless, since there is no requirement to ensure superior appearance when measuring the whole tenth of an ephah, there is no reason to then require it for the smaller vessel, and that's from Torah Kodesh. It is reasonable that since both vessels were used for the same offering, they should be of the same type. And from the fact that Rabbi Meir holds that the vessels used for the high priest's griddle cake offering also hold their measures when leveled, we can extrapolate that according to the rabbis who hold that both vessels were used for the high priest's griddle cake offering, both of them held their measures when level. Rami Bar Hama raised another dilemma before Rav Chisda. With regard to the dough used for the high priest's griddle cake offering, with what would one divide? So what's the footnote? Chalkon. It is not entirely clear what division the Gemara is referring to. This depends on how exactly how the griddle cake offering was prepared. The Rambam in Sefer Avoda, Hilchot Maaseh Kabbalah 13:2-4 explains that after dividing the tenth of an ephah into two equal portions, each portion would be used to bake 6 loaves, making a total of 12 loaves. Each loaf would then be broken into 2 approximately equal-sized pieces, and then half of each loaf was sacrificed in the morning and half in the afternoon. The other half in the afternoon. According to this understanding, Rami Bar Hama's dilemma concerned the dividing of the loaves themselves. The Raiva disagreed with the Rambam's explanation. First, he claimed that there is no source that suggests that the loaves themselves were broken in half. Furthermore, he claims that even if the Rambam was correct on that point, it is untenable that any measuring in the temple would be done through approximation. The commentaries on the Rambam, with all these questions, advise that the Rambam based his opinion on the Gemara here, which concludes that the division was made with one's hand, which suggests that it was done through approximation. And as the case of Mishra, Asbaz, and Mari Kocha, the Raiva himself holds that after the tenth of an ephah of flour is divided into 2 precisely equal portions, 6 loaves will be prepared for each portion, with one set of 6 loaves being sacrificed in the morning and the other set in the afternoon. Many other commentaries also hold in accordance with this explanation, and therefore hold that the dilemma concerns the division of each portion to 6 loaves that was done before they were baked, either once the dough had been formed, Rashi, or even earlier, immediately after the flour had been divided into 2 equal portions, Totvot, into loaves of the offering, 6 in the morning and 6 in the afternoon. Was the division done with one's hand or with a measuring vessel? Now Chesed said to him, it is obvious that it was divided with one's hand, as if one suggested it was done with a measuring vessel. Would one bring scales to Tanei? These scales are fashioned of a bar or leveler, from which a pan hung on each end by cords. The item that was being weighed was placed in one pan, while the standardized weights were placed in the other pan. The scales were hung or held from a ring attached to the middle of the lever, called a fulcrum, around which the leveler could rotate freely. Some added there was a short rod firmly attached to the middle of the lever at a right angle to it, from which any tilt of the scales could immediately be discerned. That rod is sometimes referred to as the soul of the scales. See Bava Batra 89a, as the accuracy of the scales is determined by it. And there's a picture here on page 250 if you have the Shanshel edition of the Gemara. From the Greek tutane, meaning scales. Although in its original meaning this term refers to the entire scales, it was also used to refer specifically to the bar to which the pan of scales were attached into the temple courtyard for this purpose. Rami Bar Hama responds, and let him bring scales into the courtyard. Rav Chisda explains, since in God's admonition of the Jewish people, the act of weighing bread is written as part of a curse. When I break your staff of bread, 10 women shall bake your bread in one oven, and they shall deliver your bread again by weight, and you shall eat and not be satisfied. Leviticus 26:26. As weighing bread is generally performed only at a time of famine, therefore it's not proper conduct to weigh the dough in the temple. Rami Bar Hama raised another item before Rav Chisda. With regard to the shrew bread, what is Allah as to whether it consecrates handfuls? A handful removed from a meal offering may be sacrificed only once it has been consecrated in the service as a foot for the handful. If the handful is instead placed on the shubha table at the level of the shubha, the table consecrates a handful to the extent that it can become disqualified, but not to the extent that it may actually be sacrificed. This is a contrary of Chisda's response to Rami Bar Hama's dilemma in Rambam Sefer Avoda, Hilchot Mezunei, Megdoshin 11:4. Removed from the meal offering or from frankincense that were not consecrated by being placed in the service vessel as they should have been, but instead were placed on the upper part of the table. Magodesh, on the upper part. The table was constructed of a flat surface and a framework mounted above a flat surface upon which the loaves rested. It is unclear where exactly the handfuls were placed in Rami Baham's dilemma. Some commentators explain that they were placed between the loaves of shubed, either upon the framework themselves, or Shlomo explaining Rashi, or upon the loaves of Bnei Gershon or Hagolah. Even if the handfuls were placed on the loaves, the table could still consecrate them, as once the loaves are placed upon the table, they take on the state of the table itself, and therefore they are not considered to be in the position between the handfuls and the table, and that's from the Ezra Makomashi Rashi manuscript part of the table. The Gemara does not explain to which handfuls Rami Baham's dilemma is referring. Some commentators explain it is referring to handfuls removed from the meal offering that were not consecrated by being placed in the service vessel as they should have been. Alternatively, the reference is to the handfuls of frankincense that are supposed to be placed together with the shubed. One generally consecrates by placing them in bowls, and then the bowls with the frankincense are arranged together with the shubed. The dilemma concerns the case where the frankincense was not placed into bowls, but instead placed directly onto the upper part of the table. Rashi manuscript. Some commentators explain the dilemma refers equally to both handfuls of the meal offering and to the frankincense, is Rashi. Between the words of the shubed, the Gemara clarifies the dilemma. Those who once say that from the fact that the table consecrates the level of the shubed placed upon it, it follows that all the consecrated handfuls placed upon it. Or perhaps the table consecrates only that which is fit for it, i.e. the load, but does not consecrate that which is not fit for it, such as the handfuls. Rabbi Chesed said to him, the table does not consecrate these handfuls. Rami Bahama retorted, is that so? But then Rabbi Yochanan said the shubeds were longer than the length of the table. Accordingly, it was necessary to fold the edges of the loaves in order that they would rest entirely upon the table itself and not protrude past its edges. How much of each side needed to be folded up is subject to a Tanaic dispute concerning the length of the table. See 896a. According to the statement of the one who says that one folds 2.5 handbreadths from each side of the loaves, it emerges that the table consecrates 15 handbreadths above it, as there were 6 loaves on each side of the table, which were each 2.5 handbreadths high. And according to the statement of one who says that one folds 2 handbreadths from each side of the loaves, it emerges that the table consecrates 12 handbreadths above it. Rabbi Yochanan stated that the table consecrated that which is placed above it, regardless of whether it is fit for the table or not. Rabbi Chesed said to him, when I said that the table does not consecrate the handfuls, I meant that it does not consecrate them to the extent that they can be sacrificed on the altar, but it certainly consecrates them to the extent that they will be disqualified by the same disqualification applied to handfuls that were consecrated by being placed in the service vessel, either by being left overnight or by coming into contact with the richly impure person and immersed that day. Mishnah. There were 7 measuring vessels for liquids in the temple. There was a vessel for 1 hin, i.e. 12 log. 3 vessels were used to measure the oil and wine for the meal offerings and libations that accompanied the sacrifice of an animal. For bull there was a vessel of 1/2 of a hin, i.e. 6 log, and for ram there was 1/3 of a hin, i.e. 4 log, and for a lamb there was 1/4 of a hin, i.e. 3 log. In addition, there was a vessel that held 1 log. This is the basic unit of volume for liquids that was used by the sages. It is equivalent to the volume of 6 eggs, which is a quarter cup or 24/4 of a seah. One halakha authority estimates it to be between 300 and 600 milliliters to measure the oil for all standard meal offerings, and another that held 1/2 of a log for measuring the water used in the rite of a woman suspected by a husband having been unfaithful, sota, and also for the oil used in the load accompanying the thanks offering, see 88a, and another that held 1/4 of a log for measuring the water used in the purification of a leper, and also for the oil used in the wafers and loaves that the Nazarite brings on the day that his term of Nazarite ends. Rabbi Eliezer, son of Rabbi Sadok, says it was not necessary to have several vessels of different sizes, rather there were gradations, shenosos. What does that mean? Generally, measuring vessels were filled completely in order to measure a substance of the same volume as the vessel. When gradation markings were placed up its side, the vessel could be used to measure a variety of different volumes. These markings were either etched into the metal on the inside of the vessel or added to the outside of the vessel. This term usually appears in the plural form as it invariably refers to several gradations. The singular form is shinit. Shinet maybe. Some say it derives from Akkadian, Some others say its source is the Hebrew word shein, tooth. Alternatively, it is derived from the root shin nun hey, meaning to change as a shein, not to was separated and differentiated to one another. On the vessel that held one hin, indicating that until here is a quantity needed for the bull, and until here is a quantity needed for the ram, until here the quantity needed for the lamb. And Shimon says there was no vessel there in the temple that held one hin. As what purpose could one hin vessel serve? That volume of liquid was never used in an offering. Rather, there was an additional measuring vessel of 1.5 log there in the temple, which completed the tally of 7 vessels, with which one would measure the oil used for the griddle cake meal offering of the high priest, and 1.5 log were used in the morning, and 1.5 log in the afternoon. Gemara. The sages taught in the Bible that there were 7 measuring vessels for liquids in the temple. There were 7 measuring vessels for liquids in the temple: 1 hin, one half a hin, 1/3 of a hin, 1/4 of a hin, 1 log, 1/2 of a log, and 1/4 of a log. For what purpose were these vessels used? The 1/2 of a hin, 1/3 of a hin, and 1/4 of a hin were used for measuring the libation that accompanied meat animal offerings. The log was for measuring the oil for meal offerings. The 1/2 of a log was for measuring oil for the lamp and the candelabrum, and 1/4 of a log for dividing the oil for the griddle cake offering. So the Rambam Sefer Red Hilchot Kliyah Mikdash 117 listed in ascending order of size. They held 1/4 of a log, 1/2 of a log, 1 log, 1/4 of a hin, 1/3 of a hin, and 1/2 of a hin and 1 hin. This statement by Yehuda Rabbi Meir says that there were 7 vessels, but list them in descending order: 1 hin, 1/2 of a hin, 1/3 of a hin, 1/4 of a hin, 1 log, 1/2 of a log, and 1/4 of a log. Rabbi Shimon says there was no vessel there in the temple that held 1 hin. As what purpose could 1 hin vessel serve? That volume of liquid was never used in an offering. That's the end of the Omid. In conclusion, the conclusion of the Daf is a classic Gemaric pivot, moving from the minutiae of temple measurements to broader theological principle. We transition from the specific to the universal. The Gemara calls a brighter, a teaching from the Tanaic period that relates 3 instances. I'm not sure what that means. Well, we must particularly follow the letter of the law, as we saw with the different measurements. To avoid Hashem's service of God also requires seichel, wisdom, and the courage to act with our own understanding for the sake of heaven. It's about balancing the letter of the law with the spirit. This is the essence of Yiras Shamayim, fear of heaven, explained by the Russian's commentary, knowing when to adhere strictly and when to act with deeper intuitive sense of God's will. So in the end, what began as a discussion of 1/10 of an eighth becomes a lesson on the life of... I'm not sure what that means. Thank you for joining me and wish you all the best. Bye.